All right, guys. Today was a very good day, only because I choose it. But I don't know. I think we're episode 292. This is 293. So the last video I did was declaring failure because I'm still not able to kind of like stick to how I want this day to move. But let's just say there's a lot that I'm probably dealing with. Okay. I started a video yesterday that didn't record. It was the difference between the written language and the spoken language. Here, I even scratched it, spoke for 15, 20 minutes, maybe like 5 to 10 minutes, and then realized I wasn't recording. When these things happen, I literally just stop and go like, for whatever it is, I'm not involved. So just keep it at that and call it in for a day. The reason I actually wrote this is because I was having a conversation with this guy that talked to me how he very much has been trying his best to engage in. He works with kids, and his goal is to be able to like allow kids to be able to express properly. It's funny because he reflected on the roads and basically everything that's happening around, like in society, to how what we're taught and how we're taught and the direction in which we are taught to actually look at the world has a big element of reality, the joint reality, the combined reality of everyone that kind of like allowed for the construction of society and allowed for the construction of the world. There's a big element of that that's missing. And it feels, and when he said that he was talking about the language and how important it is. uh, it stuck with me how when I actually started writing more, I started articulating things differently, and then my mind started thinking in the process of how I articulate in the written way. It gave me a chance to kind of like look back at the olden times when they used to like, because they never used to communicate by text and press enter. We used to communicate through like either an email, and that's the old times, right? But like before that, they used to write a letter, and it has to be a substantial letter. Which brings me to the storyline of human beings and maybe our evolution through communication, and how I feel like through texting, we're losing the culture because ultimately we're sending our message a lot faster than we normally would. And that's through like, this is what I'm feeling like, and this is what I'm looking at, or this is what I'm thinking. So we're not actually taking the time to process what it is we're trying to tell people and how they might understand it, and if we're actually being expressive enough to do it. But that's something that I think I've had this conversation once with my dad, or maybe it was, yeah, uh, over 100 plus years ago, let's say like 200 years ago, when we wanted to send a message to somebody we know somewhere, we had to write a letter. And that letter basically, and let's talk about the evolution of sending a message. That letter would have to be written by you, and it would take any time between a month to maybe a year plus if it ever makes the other direction, to the other side, the recipient. It's because I had to go through boats, planes, trains, like random kinds of stuff used to happen. The world was wild back then. Like between the whole, there's just like separate parts of the world. It's just kind of like trying to evolve, and we're trying to compete, or we're trying to understand. And there was a lot of lawlessness, and it was just like probably the most beautiful time that ever actually passed onto Earth, where human beings were still discovering, we were not being pretentious. And so I felt like at that moment, when somebody is going to write a message and not never knowing if it's going to reach somebody else or not, and then having to wait until the other person kind of like responds to make sure that they actually received it, allows you to kind of like think heavily about what you're going to send and how you would want them to actually come back. And so it's written in a certain kind of way. But as we evolved, man, it went from like 1 month to 3 probably fucking years or more, or never, whatever, for things to reach until we had like proper mail systems and proper people that work in mail and proper like delivery people. And eventually we had trains, and after that we had cars, and after that we had like the actual mail system worldwide, where there are planes that carry mail, trains that carry mail. And then early 90s, that's what was happening. We were evolving. So like a letter sent that used to take, for example, 6 months to a year, now would take 1 month to 3 months. And then the internet came about, and then an email went from like 1 month for you to receive something across the world. Now it takes like maximum an hour. I mean, you're talking like early 70s, 80s. It was still being developed. And then early 90s, an email would take 5 seconds. Now an email would take a fraction of a second. And so I'd imagine the people that are actually like, it seems like what we're doing is the better we're trying to create this communicative channel between each other, we're losing a whole lot of the actual communication. Like I can send an email in 5 seconds, but let's face it, how much time would I actually have to spend in order for that email to literally explain what I want? And the details that we could actually just realize about ourselves when we're trying to write the email, the emotions that come out when we're trying to write what we're trying to express to the other side. So I remember this train of thought that I had once, and basically this guy, when he was talking about education and the difference between like how to express to people, I reflected on how culture is expressed through language. Because when I started learning French, I couldn't understand shit until I started getting more exposed to French culture, French music. And I didn't learn words at that point. I just learned the vibe of how the French people speak French. And my French became stronger when I went to Cote d'Ivoire once for like 3 weeks or more than once. In Ivory Coast, I was able to actually see the difference in culture between like French and Ivorian French. And then when I came back from Ivory Coast, I was able to engage with the Guinean people in Liberia, and their French is comes from a different place. Like it's a different culture. It's like closer countries, but like again, like it's a different expression. And that's when I was able to like truly just, it became easier for me to understand the language, and it became easier for me to attempt to speak it. Because at the very least, I could actually think from a certain mindset, which is built from the observations of the cultures that I actually like that engage with this language. And it made me think about how I try to engage with the language and how I talked about it many times before. But the difference between the written language and the spoken language is like, I don't know if you guys have read documentation. I don't know if you guys have like read contracts. There are a lot of different words that are used in different places to articulate specifically and to make sure we don't actually like misunderstand. And what's the difference between a contractual agreement and a verbal agreement? A verbal agreement is basically both of us are under the whole guise that we understood exactly what we want from each other. But when we write it in contract and we start writing all these details, it's no longer the same thing that we talked about. Because once you flush it out, all these details start becoming, you need to use a different style in language in order to express them, to not be offensive, to not be aggressive, to make sure you're protecting yourself without like letting them know that, hey, I don't know what. It becomes an art. Like, I've talked with lawyers before, and the way they explain how they actually like, it's the game between two lawyers, basically. Whatever two people negotiate, the lawyers kind of like have to one up themselves in how they write the contract and how they engage with each other. It's funny because, like, the written language literally is the expression of our culture. And the reason I say written is because spoken language is the simplest form of us actually engaging with each other. There's no need for depth most of the time. Because in the real world, when we're active, what we're effectively doing is just kind of like seeing how fast, how best we could just like create some form of engagement for the sake of just moving forward and like doing something else. It seems like we're always rushed. And there's a certain depth to actually having a conversation and being able to articulate yourself in a way that you would be like writing a letter or truly expressing what you understand about yourself versus having to do so within like 5 minutes of back and forth. Because let's face it, most of our conversations are small talk. So there's a very big difference. And he kind of like pointed out beautifully when he described how culture kind of like emerges from the language. And it reminded me of my experiences with language and culture and just like the stories about and the research that I've had about our history and how we evolved and how we grew into able to this modern ability to kind of like connect. But the reality is the true connection that used to be expressed is gone. It's easier to connect. It's just harder to like properly form a connection. And here's a video.